In a few days from now, the Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will be presenting her 6th Union budget. Now, this budget is a little different from the ones before. It'll be an interim budget or a vote on account budget. What that exactly means is that this will look at expenditures or allocating funds till the general elections from the beginning of the financial year. Now, after the elections, the government that comes into power will be presenting a full-fledged budget. And in this particular show, that's exactly what we'll be focusing on, these particular expenditures, be it the subsidies, be it the ongoing projects, be it salaries, wages, and other revenue expenditure. We will be looking at, with experts, on what exactly are the expenditures that exist, the expenditures that have been committed, and the ones to look forward to. Stay tuned with us. Today, I'm joined by three very special guests to infuse this conversation with their math and their micro sense and help us understand the role of these elements in the fiscal that is yet to come. Firstly, I want to introduce Aditi Nair, Chief Economist at ICRA Limited. We also have with us Yuvika Singhal, economist at Quant Eco Research, and I also have with me Dr. Lekha Chakrabarti, professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She's also a member of the Board of Management at the International Institute of Public Finance. Very many thanks for joining us today. Thank you so much for coming. Firstly, I want to start with you, Aditi. As we wind up to the end of FY24, what we're seeing is that in December, the supplementary demand for grants was not a big amount. It was matched by a good amount of savings, in fact. What does the expenditure profile look like for the 3 months that is left in the last quarter? Do you think there would be a requirement for another supplementary demand for grants?
Thank you, Janani. Well, certainly if we look at the expenditure up to November, which is the data that we have so far, we've seen a modest growth in revenue expenditure and we've seen a very high growth in capital expenditure in the first half of the year, followed by a slowdown in the next 2 months, which is October and November. Now, looking ahead, as you very rightly pointed out, the first supplementary demand for grants was actually expecting, and we do think that there needs to be another supplementary in this quarter, particularly for food subsidy. Possibly the outgo for Q4 was left out of the first supplementary, so that is something that we expect needs to be allocated in a supplementary in this quarter. And also the amount under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme needs to be enhanced further based on the data that we have on the percentages generated, etc. So overall, we think that between December and March as well, revenue expenditure needs to grow by about 4% YOY, and this will entail a small overshooting of the budgeted target. But we do expect that the capex will end up undershooting the very ambitious target of 10 trillion that we had for FY24, and therefore these two will probably end up netting each other out.
You know, the capex is quite an interesting topic, but I want to reserve that conversation for a little later. I want to come to you, Yuvika. Similar question. Let's look at the subsidies. Like one, as was pointed out, food and Manrega, top of the mind, top of the list, most of the times when we're looking at it. What are the other major subsidies looking like? Say fertilizer, say petroleum. What do they look like for the year to come?
So for FY24, specifically talking about subsidies, we are seeing a minor upside both on fertilizer as well as food. Fertilizer largely because global fertilizer prices have been on the upside, and that has granted a marginal upside of about 20,000 crores to the fertilizer bill. So against a budgeted estimate about 1.75, we could see the number going up close to about rupees 2 trillion. And a similar upside can be built on for food, largely because we know that the government has committed to the extension of the free food grain program under the National Food Security Act. So a 20,000 crore upside there could also be looked at on the food. So against a budgeted number of 2 trillion, we are penciling in a food subsidy bill for FY24 to 2.2 trillion. Now, mind you, on the food side, there is likely to be some cushion coming in from the open market sales of wheat that the Food Corporation of India has undertaken. And we hear that there could be some savings to the tune of about 15,000 odd crores coming in from there. So some kind of cushion is getting built in on the food subsidy front. Now, if you would recall, the petroleum subsidy over the years has been completely, waned off in the economy, and very minute numbers are allocated in the budget over the last many years. But this year, we know that the government has had the intention of expanding the PM Ujjwala scheme to 75 lakh new connections over the course of next 3 years. There has been a rupee 100 reduction to the current PM Ujjwala scheme beneficiaries, and also a 200 rupee cut in the LPG gas price or the gas cylinder for all the households, which also so far have been absorbed by the OMC, the losses that is. But somewhere they need also some assistance going forward. So keeping all these factors in mind, I think there is a small upside that we are looking at, probably in the range of 40 or 50 or 1,000 rupees crore for FY24 subsidy bill.
That does bode well, but Dr. Chakraborty, I want to come to you with one of the key components that we've heard, and I want to bring in a context for the audience. For the larger part of the year, we've heard about El Nino, and we've heard about how it is also affecting the acreage. Now, if you look at monsoon acreage, there are some crops like groundnuts, like some of the pulses, they have seen some impact in terms of sown acreage. Now, how much of this is a concern for the food subsidy bill? We already know that this is going to be an important element in the year to come. What is your understanding now based on the factors that we can see right now?
Thank you. But we need to look at this question from the macro perspective. If there is a narrative that the high deficit and high debt is okay, that is going to get targeted on capex rather than spending on social infrastructure or food subsidies. That's my hunch. So in that perspective, maximum what they do is, if they are focusing on the food security and the agriculture sector, then the other sectors like education, health, or workforce participation is going to get crowded out. So how they pitch on social infrastructure budget, that decides whether there will be an increased focus on food security and the agriculture sector. But we have a space in terms of the national adaptation communication, because India has to communicate that. So within the national adaptation communication, how the agriculture will appear into this climate-related budget or the green budget, that's the way I look at this question.
Okay. I think this also throws up some of the elements I wanted to touch upon. Aditi, coming to you here, we've spoken quite a bit about the subsidies. We have a little predictability on that. Let's look at the larger themes of what has also been some of the bigger expenditures that the government has seen so far. Defense, transportation, these have been some, but also government schemes, the PM Awas Yojana, or in fact the Jal Jeevan Mission. These have captured quite a bit of the outlay also. So what do you think, how much will they require in the year to come in FY25? Is there some sense on that?
So, in the interim budget, you should assume that it's going to be made in a business as usual scenario. And for the schemes which are ongoing, the amount of money required for business as usual for 4 months is what you should expect to be put into the interim budget. After that, once we are in July and the full budget for the year comes around, then it's going to be the new government's priorities. And even if it's the same government, there can be some amount of tinkering on priorities. Some new schemes could get announced at that stage, and that will really determine what kind of allocations we end up seeing across different schemes. Also, in terms of increasing beneficiaries or enhancing the the benefits under some schemes, that is possible. You could also see some schemes that end up getting wound down as the intended beneficiaries are covered. So for the July budget, I think it's more of an open slate in terms of what the government decides to do, what it wants to really throw its priorities behind. And for now, it's going to be more of business as usual. One thing is there that, as Yuvika pointed out, part of the reason that we're seeing higher subsidies this year is global prices that led to an increase in the fertilizer subsidy. And there actually we're quite hopeful that next year, if things turn out to be relatively calm, then at least on the fertilizer subsidy, we are expecting there to be some savings between FY24 and FY25, which will give us a little bit of cushion to really fund other priorities that the government may choose to fund next year.
This throws up another interesting question. While you said, right now it's going to be business as usual, coming to you, there is some elements that we cannot ignore. The interest payments I'm talking about. So we already understand that this is a very big chunk. If you look at the last budget, over 10 lakh crore went in interest payments. It was a very major component of it. What is your sense on the interest payments for the fiscal to come? Because no matter which government comes, the burden to bear remains.
Rightly pointed out, Janani, what we have seen is that typically in India, revenue expenditure is sticky. And the degree of this stickiness has actually risen manifold in the post-COVID era, largely because at the time when COVID hit us, there was a need to provide a fiscal boost to the economy. And this fiscal boost essentially meant a higher fiscal deficit, higher borrowing from the government, and the rise in the debt obligation of the government has seen a spillover into the interest payments, which have continued to rise in the last 4 years. So if you look at, the share of interest payments in the total revenue expenditure, they almost garner close to about 33% of the revenue expenditure, which is a sizable chunk. You add on subsidies with a share of 10 to 12%, and probably, salaries and allowances, pensions that the government has to pay, which is another 10%. You're probably looking at 55% of the revenue expenditure turning out to be extremely sticky, which cannot be not done away. So what essentially what that means is that a large part of the revenue expenditure gets tied to certain allocations that the government is already committed to, and only 45% is left for to be allocated in different social schemes. Now, having said so, for next year, FY25 as well, we are penciling in a fairly high growth in the interest payments, somewhere close to about 15%. Assuming that subsidies remain almost at par at FY24 or a small upside, and assuming that obviously there will be no cutback in allowances, pensions, salaries, what this would essentially mean is that to be able to achieve a meaningful fiscal consolidation of anywhere between 60 to 70 basis points, the government will have little scope to increase the untied part of the revenue expenditure or the non-sticky part of the revenue expenditure. And that's the reason why we believe that the government will have little scope or probably no scope to announce big bang reforms or populist measures. And we'll probably be looking at just continuity in schemes and the allocations between FY24 and FY25.
Of course, this is not accounting for what it is going to be a poll year, so we'll have to wait and watch what it really means. Aditi, quickly coming to you, 15% on interest payments, is that also some closer to your estimate?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing that typically when new schemes are announced, they take some time to operationalize. So the cost of running a new scheme only picks up in year 2 and year 3. First you announce a scheme, then you notify it, then you find the beneficiaries. So you can kind of still expect the impact to be limited in year 1. But I agree with you, Vika. Overall, our expectation is also that if we have to hold on to the medium-term fiscal deficit target, there's just 2 more years to achieve it. So at least half the gap between where we are in FY24 and where we need to be in FY26 needs to be met in FY25. So that means that we have to have modest growth in revenue expenditure, and also we believe that the scope for increasing capital expenditure is going to be limited to about 10% over our expectation of the actual turnout of capex in FY24. So we think that capex will undershoot the budgeted level by about 75,000 crore. And on that, we think a 10% growth is feasible with bringing the fiscal deficit down to about 5.3% of GDP.
Right. More on this conversation. We'll slip into a small ad break, but on the other side, we'll talk about the mathematics of it all, the fiscal deficit and what it means for that glide path. Stick around with us. Welcome back. We're talking about the Budget 2024, the Takeoff series. Here I'm talking to economists about, in particular, the government expenditures and what to expect. Now, we've reached that part of the conversation where the numbers and particularly the mathematics of the fiscal deficit is going to overtake. Now, Aditi, I want to come to you. You had mentioned a while back that 60 to 70 basis points, perhaps a reasonable one. For context for our audience, the government plans to achieve 4.5% of fiscal deficit by FY26, and they are on a glide path to achieve that. Last year, they were successful. This year, they seem to be going on track. More on that from Aditi Nair. Aditi, tell us what it looks like on this glide path. What does that cut have to be for this particular year, mathematically speaking at least?
So just to give you a little bit of context, our expectation for FY24 is that tax revenues and non-tax revenues will be a little bit higher than what was budgeted, but there'll be a shortfall on the disinvestment side. So the net upside on the revenue side is modest. It's almost flat. And on the expenditure side, we expect revenue expenditure to overshoot and capital expenditure to undershoot. So net, in absolute terms, we think the fiscal deficit will be very close to the budgeted number. But because the nominal GDP is likely to be smaller than what was included in the budget estimates last year, therefore, the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio could come in at 6% instead of 5.9%. From there, what I was saying earlier was that the government could consider targeting a fiscal deficit of 5.3% of GDP for FY25. So basically, 70 basis points in terms of the move towards the fiscal consolidation glide path. Within this, our expectation is that our tax revenues will grow by about 11% on a nominal GDP growth of 9.5%. So we've assumed a decent buoyancy. And broadly, disinvestment should be kept at a modest level. Market doesn't like to see very large numbers. Then they start doubting the fiscal math early on, and that's not very helpful for yields. On expenditure, partly we think that fertilizer subsidy is likely to give a little bit of a cushion next year as compared to this year. But yes, revenue expenditure growth cannot be very high in FY25. Capex could grow by about 10% to balance out the math. Now, if we want capex to grow by more than this, for every 10 basis points of higher fiscal deficit that we're okay to live with, we could have higher capex of 32,500 crores or so. That's the trade-off.
Right. That is an interesting trade-off, and I want to pose a similar question to Yuvika. Yuvika, what are some of the... I also want to, ask you, what are some of the elements that are exerting pressure on the fiscal deficit? We spoke about disinvestment, and I think that's been on the field of vision for quite some time now. There is a little bit of an expectation also that whether or not it will be reached. But I want to ask you about, the other factors that are exerting pressure and your take on the fiscal deficit glide path.
Right. So again, for FY24, where we differ from Aditi's estimates is that we are looking at a larger buoyancy on the tax revenue side, especially the direct taxes. Indirect taxes, there could be a shortfall vis-a-vis budgeted estimates and upside in non-tax revenues too. So both these upsides put together on the tax and the non-tax front, we could look at an increase vis-a-vis the budgeted estimate in gross tax revenues, somewhere close to about 1 lakh crore. And netting out the state's share, that is the devolution part of it, we could still be looking at a net upside of about 80,000 odd crores. And how we think this will be adjusted on the expenditure side, clearly to be able to maintain the fiscal deficit target of 5.9 with a slower nominal GDP growth, that will take away 30-odd thousand crores from the 80,000 upside in revenues, gross revenues. And the remaining part of it will largely be accounted for on the revenue side, given that there is an upside already getting built into fertilizer, food, and also Manrega. So nearly about 20,000 odd crore upside each to these three elements. So that's how we think the fiscal max will balance out for FY24.
Right. Dr. Chakrabarti, I want to also put a face to some of these concerns that are lying in the background now. In the macro sense of it all, yes, there is a high debt to GDP that we've sort of touched upon. There's also in the next year, we will see the bond inclusion, the JPM bond inclusion, that will be one. We're also going to be seeing how we're going to tackle, inflation and how this fiscal deficit will be a tool helping the RBI rein in the inflation. So, these are some of the broader concerns that lie underneath the surface. How much of a pressure do they exert on the fiscal deficit glide path?
Yeah, when we talk about this fiscal risk, I think the four important variables which we need to look into is revenue deficit and the public debt, fiscal deficit, and interest receipts to, the revenue receipts, interest payments to revenue receipts. So if these four parameters are not okay, we are into fiscal risk, and that's exactly going to happen. Now, the macro perspective is, of course, there is no narrative that in the Modi regime, high public debt that's mounting and we are going to get haywire. That narrative is no longer there just because it's closely tied to the capex formation in the economy. But the pressure points, as Aditi and Yamini pointed out, the pressure points is we are not getting the fiscal marksmanship correct for the disinvestment proceeds. The way it is, visioned, we are not able to match up to our aspirations. So we need to look into the budget credibility or the fiscal marksmanship question from the perspective of the disinvestment proceeds, because it's not working out, but now taxes are buoyant. So the path to consolidation is through this tax buoyancy, then that's quite okay. But expenditure compression will have adverse macroeconomic consequences. So that policy coordination, as you mentioned, with the RBI needs to be carried out.
Ms. Singhal, I'm coming to you. Yes, of course, we understand now the sustainability of the capex. What are the engines that are not firing? Disinvestment, perhaps, yes, one. Asset monetization could be better. You did say direct taxation will lead the pack. They have been leading the revenue this time around too. Talk to us about the sustainability of this capex number.
So, Janani, we have to understand that the government's capex growth of nearly 30% over the last 4 years came against the background of COVID. And that was at that point of time necessary because clearly the economy was in doldrums, economic activity came to a standstill, and there was no question of private capex pushing it growth. So it served us well. It did the heavy lifting at that point in time. Now, having said so, whether the idea here was that, once again, that with the government going gung-ho on capex, will it be able to crowd in private sector capex? Now, we have seen, like you said, we have seen the buck moving on private capex, while not probably to the extent that one would desire, but we have seen the needle moving somewhat materially in the course of FY24. Probably once the uncertainty related to the election cycle is past us, we could see a much more comprehensive build-up in the private capex cycle. Now, we have historically seen that typically in 2 to 3 quarters before the general elections, the corporates do not announce new investments typically because they would want to ride that uncertainty, and rightly so. Now, also when we talk about capex, we have this overemphasis in talking about government capex and private capex. But we seldom talk about the third side or third angle of the capex story, which is led by households. And mind you, this accounts for nearly 40% of the total capex in the outstanding capex in the country. So households have seen a very strong capex growth in the last 2 to 3 years. In the post-COVID phase, there has been capex that has been generated with investments in the residential or the real estate side of the economy. What we expect is in going into FY25, while the government will have the tall order of achieving a fiscal consolidation of about 60 odd basis points, they will need to let go the pedal of the capex. So we will continue to see support from capex, but probably just about a annualized growth rate of somewhere around 10 to 11%. Right. This is premised on the fact that you will continue to see household capex provide support to the capex story and the private capex turnaround happening in a much more meaningful way. So probably we are looking at a capex story firing on all cylinders in FY25.
Right. Before I let you all go, I want to know also about the state capex and how the states are particularly looking at this. Dr. Chakraborty, I want to come to you with this before we wrap this up. Is it satisfactory the way the states have also been looking at it? Of course, the union government capex is one aspect of it. It is also inclusive of the state capex and some that they give to the states as the 1 lakh crore amount. Speaking on that particular amount, speaking on the utilization of that, are you satisfied with the way things have been going?
Yeah, that's a good question, because here we are taking that fiscal federalism into, the 16th Finance Commission is also on board. So from that perspective, this question is very relevant, and the states are doing heavy lifting when it comes to the capex. It's not the center. So the question related to the utilization, that varies, but the figures are out related to the physical infrastructure, and Kerala, surprisingly is doing better despite, all the stigma attached to the state related to the infrastructure spending. But we know that these are off-budget liabilities or off-budget spending by the states related to the capex. But that's a bigger question, because recently the net borrowing ceiling, that incorporates the off-budget liability related to the capex. So that's shrinking the fiscal space of the state governments. So that's a big bargaining point from the states, and we need to find a solution for that. Why this off-budget liabilities were incorporated within the borrowing ceiling. So the states are very vocal about it, and that's a point of tension between the center-state financial relations. And good that you raised that question. Thank you.
And I think that's as good a note as to end. Very many thanks for joining us today. It has been a very interesting conversation for me and for our viewers, I'm sure. Thank you for talking to us. And as this is a wrap on the expenditure element of the Budget 2024 Takeoff series, thank you for watching.